My name is Justin Sonnett. I graduated from Laney in 2008. Had Miss Cotton as my teacher for, I think, 2 semesters, I believe, and it was awesome. Loved every bit of it. So it's really cool to be back and tell you about a new desalination technology that we're working on that is powered only by waves. So, alright, so without further ado, I guess I can go ahead and kick off this video if you guys are ready for it. Again, you'll be like the very first eyes to see this.
When you think of drought, you probably think of a place that looks like this, a dry, arid desert with few signs of life. But in reality, almost a third of all people suffering from water scarcity live in a place like this. 97% of the water on our planet is locked away in the oceans, and without access to desalination, that water might as well be sand.
Unfortunately, today's desalination requires massive amounts of energy. Power in island communities is both expensive and polluting. Many places burn fuel oil brought in on ships. The need for so much power and the cost of it makes desalination incredibly expensive. The challenges of generating power in more isolated coastal communities means that many places lack access to reliable power.
This is all
Sucking rainwater is a great option, but in the dry season, no power means no water.
To solve these issues, we've created SAROS, a wave-powered desalination system which uses the staggering amount of energy found in waves to access the almost limitless supply of water found in our oceans. We're completely removing the dependency on electricity and fossil fuels to create one of the first environmentally conscious forms of desalination, allowing us to bring affordable fresh water to people in coastal areas all around the world.
I've always loved the ocean. Being able to spend time in the water has given me an appreciation for the power of the ocean and the importance of protecting it for future generations. Since I was a kid, I've always loved designing and building things that solve problems, and working with SAROS has allowed me to combine my passion for the sea with my love for just building cool stuff.
I think we have the chance to do something here that has a real impact, both on the environment and people's lives. I've always had an appreciation for the sources of power found in nature, and being connected to nature is a really big part of my life. It's really great to work on a project that uses one of those sources of power to really make an impact in the world.
SAROS began as our senior design project while at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte. We knew from the beginning that we wanted this to be more than just a project. We wanted this to be something real. We began researching the need for water around the world and asking ourselves, who could use something like this?
What we found was this huge collection of people that have been largely ignored until now. It's a significant challenge to get water to these coastal areas, particularly small islands. It's easy to picture luxurious resorts and yachts in places like the Caribbean, but there's a lot of isolated areas too. And it's not as simple as digging a well, and traditional desal plants just don't make sense. Now with SAROS, that's all changed. Soon we're going to be working with nonprofits, disaster relief organizations, aid organizations, and even private individuals and companies to bring a simple, robust, and inexpensive form of desalination to areas all around the world. We're already lining up projects in Haiti and Puerto Rico, and these are places that really need water.
And it works. Our prototypes have proven that we can successfully make water using only the power of ocean waves. And we can do so in a way that's simple and cost-effective. Now, we're refining our system into a user-friendly package and forming partnerships with awesome companies that can help us get SAROS out into the world and making a difference.
We still have some challenges ahead of us though, and we need your support.
That's right. By contributing to this project in any amount, you'll be helping to push forward the development of SAROS. When our funding goals are met, we'll be able to install our first long-term pilot project in the Caribbean.
This will be our first step towards revolutionizing the way people approach desalination, and we need your help.
Have you thought about Shark Tank?
Shark Tank. We have thought about Shark Tank. So Shark Tank, anybody watch Shark Tank here? You guys good? So Shark Tank really favors things that have really high returns really quickly for their investors. So something like this, there's a lot of development that needs to go into it, a lot of testing. And we're at least a year out from selling our first system. And then from there, we're probably 3 years out from even breaking even as a business. So Shark Tank's a little aggressive for those kind of funny things. They're pretty, I guess you could say, being profit-oriented.
Yeah.
So we're looking for, like, our investors have more of a social mission. They're much more laid back, and they want to see their money go towards good causes versus go towards making them a bunch of money quickly, so they can take that money they made and put it right back into making more money. So that's kind of the big difference. Shark Tank, though, interestingly enough, Shark Tank is a really cool way to get exposure, regardless of whether they invest or not. So I mean, just being on Shark Tank, think about everyone that sees it. So that's one, we thought about it for that purpose. Have you guys ever heard of those things called bottle freakers? They're like, they're made out of socks. So North Carolina had a really booming textile industry back in the day, and something happened, and I think everything went overseas, and they stopped making textiles, like clothes and stuff here in North Carolina. So this guy that went to UNCW actually, at the same time I did, had the idea, let's make these really cool woven, like koozies basically, that stretch over cans, and you can put them on wine bottles and all this stuff. Stuff you guys are way too young to even know anything about, I assume. But anyway, he was on Shark Tank, and he was a weird dude, and he had a really entertaining segment on Shark Tank that was really cool. And I don't think that anybody invested, but he got so much exposure, and he was able to, like, you know, spread this mission he had out to so many different people that it was really, really successful for him. So that was really cool. So now I'm going to jump into the presentation.
That other mouse is up front, it's easier to
Yes.
snip from up there.
So, hope you guys like that video. Like I see the very first people to see it. That's for a crowdfunding campaign. And like I said, I'm not asking anybody here for money, but if you could share it on Facebook and social media and stuff, if you see anything pop up on Facebook, look us up on Facebook, share it with all your friends, and tell everyone about it, because we want everybody in Wilmington to know what we're doing. Yeah.
So whenever you went to UNC Charlotte, did you have more, is there ocean engineering there, or did you just go there to study engineering?
Just mechanical engineering. Yeah, so strictly mechanical. UNC Charlotte, there's electrical, mechanical, civil, and computer engineering. So I did mechanical. Mechanical is very broad.
So what did you take before to like get to that large part? Did you do
I took a lot of time on Wikipedia, really. Yeah, that's it. Before, when we first got assigned this project in school, the very first thing we did was look up, you know, what the heck is desalination? How do you do it? And then what is wave energy? And I don't think I'd ever heard of really wave energy before we started. Yeah.
So at UNC Charlotte, you didn't take any like related like to oceans classes. You just like used your mechanical engineering degree to like figure out something to do with the ocean. So you didn't.
Yeah, exactly. Like there was zero ocean-related anything in Charlotte, actually. Like I said, it was some of my friends that, like, you know, we'd go to the beach for class.
Probably I learned it all in my class. So.
Yeah, really, it was all Miss Cotton's class. That's how it was.
Our foundation.
No, but in all seriousness, like mechanical engineering is a big component of this. But also, like the stuff I learned in your class is also a huge component. I think you had like just looking at waves and just having like personal experience with how the ocean works, and like knowing that if you like put something in the ocean, like particles are gonna grow on it. It sounds so simple to us, but like those are all serious like engineering topics that we need to address. So like the people that are on my engineering team at UNCC, they knew how to crunch the numbers, but they didn't have any practical knowledge of what goes on in the ocean. You know, and they wouldn't think like, oh, you know, hurricanes really happen. They're like not just, you know, on the Weather Channel. And what do you do if a hurricane comes? How's your booting or things like that. So there's a lot of practical experience that you can apply. And then engineering just kind of lets you kind of figure things out beforehand, I guess. I don't know. I've always loved to like build things when I was a kid. And I'd say the difference between what I would call like garage engineering, what we used to do when I was like a teenager, and engineering now is that when you have an engineering degree, you have the ability to look at a problem and kind of do a lot of math and stuff to figure out if what you're going to build is actually going to work before you build it. So like when I used to build stuff before, pre-engineering, you know, I'd build stuff and it would like break all the time, and I would just like throw some more weld on it or something like that. But in reality, like engineering lets you figure that stuff out beforehand. Yeah.
Confusing. So in the engineering class, do you do more of like math for the technology, or do you do more like actual building structure with that?
Definitely math. And I'll preface this by saying I hated math. When I was here, AP classes were like the furthest thing. AP math classes to me were just like, there's no way I'm ever going to take an AP math class. And I actually never did. When I started UNCW, I was like so far behind the curve. I was in the second. There's like basic math at UNCW, like math 101. I was in like math 102, where everybody else that was on the engineering track, they were starting in like calculus. And I like couldn't even spell calculus, you know, like. So there's a lot of math I had to learn how to do. And I will say, if there's anybody that's not a huge fan of math, like I was not a huge fan of math, you have a change of heart whenever you see that the math you're doing has an application in the real world. To me, math was just like, at the beginning, was just like kind of seem like pointless numbers. You know, you just, why am I scribbling all this stuff on paper? Why do I need to know this? But the second you can put a really cool engineering problem to it and solve that with math, it's like super cool, super cool. And that's when math became really interesting to me, I guess. And the second you start to find something interesting or start to enjoy it, it's not work anymore. You know, it almost becomes fun. So that's something that really, that's a switch that kind of clicked with me. That like, if it didn't click, I wouldn't be here right now. You know, and but the actual clicking of it was just effortless. Like once you realize there's a cool application, or once I realized there's a cool application, it was just fun to keep on going. So that was really fun. But so anyway, so SAROS from the video, it's basically a buoy that desalinates water powered only by the motion of waves. As you saw, desalination has been around for a long time in the world. There's a lot of islands that have these big desalination plants that are cranking out tons of fresh water, but they require a whole lot of energy to operate. They're building one right now on the west coast in Carlsbad, California. They're putting it right next to a power plant. It'll be the biggest desalination plant in the Western Hemisphere, and it consumes a huge amount of energy. And not that it's necessarily bad, because there are a lot of people in that part of California that need water. So that's pretty much the only option right now. But there's some negative effects there. It uses a lot of energy, and typically, I mean, pretty much generally in today's world, energy it comes at a cost, both financially and also to the environment generally. So when you think about coal generation and things like that, they can be polluting sometimes. But also there's, when you run these big desalination plants, you take salt out of water. So what you're left with is fresh water, but then you have this really salty seawater that we call brine, and that's a waste product of the desalination plant. And the brine just gets dumped back into the ocean in one spot. So these huge plants are just pumping out, tens of millions of gallons a day of this really, really salty water. There's one lagoon in some places, just one spot. And what that does is it raises the localized salinity of an area, and that can have pretty negative impacts on the wildlife there. So pretty common, but what sound like extreme cases, you can have dead zones around these outfalls where the salinity is so high that sea life can't live. So our approach, while we still, there's no way to not have brine when you make desalinated water unless you just take out so much water that you're left with like dry salt that you could like sprinkle on roads, but ultimately the salt's going to wash back somewhere. So what our approach is, we can get around that by using much smaller, more distributed systems, so that so we're not making 50 million gallons a day and we're putting all the brine in one spot. We're making 10,000 or 40,000 gallons a day. That brine goes in one spot, and then we split up production around an island so that the impacts of raised salinity are virtually not noticeable. And the other thing we do is, because the energy we use is free, and some other kind of technical advancements, I guess you could say, we run really low recovery ratios, which means that the salt water that we're taking very little fresh water out of all the salt water we bring in. So our brine discharge is not a whole lot saltier than the ocean is now. So typical seawater is around 35,000 parts per million of dissolved salts or solids. Our brine discharge is about 38 to 39,000 parts per million, and then our fresh water is about less than 400 parts per million, just to kind of put it in reference. So the brine discharge for us, we have a big advantage with our system for brine discharge. So today I'm going to tell you more about SAROS. This will be pretty quick, and what we're specifically doing. Then I'm going to tell you about desalination, and how the world desalinates water, and the pros and cons about all those things of it. And then my favorite part is I'm going to tell you about oceanography. I think that's really, really cool, really fascinating. So as you know, SAROS is turning waves into fresh water. You probably think, like when you think of drought, you think of a place that looks like this. But in fact, there's islands all over the world that, even though they're surrounded by water, it's all seawater. And without desalination, it's useless. You can't drink salt water. It will actually make you less hydrated. So it's amazing how many places throughout the world are coastal regions that struggle with water. It's not just people in deserts that you think carry buckets of water on their shoulders from wells and things that they dig. Islands have big problems too, and the problem with islands is that you can't dig a well on an island because you're so close to the ocean that if you dig a well, the groundwater is even salty. So they really have no option except to collect rainwater. And surprisingly, in a lot of developed places now, they actually barge water in ships over these places, which to us is just so foreign sounding. We turn on a faucet and out comes water, but it's really easy to take for granted. A lot of places have to actually fill up ships full of water and take them to islands, which is just like the craziest thing to me. I met these people they started a company where they're taking water from like Curacao, which is in South America, and they have this like tugboat, and they have these giant bags, and they fill these giant bags with fresh water in Curacao, which is a surplus of water, and then they just tow these bags across the Caribbean Ocean to Barbados. I think it's Barbados, somewhere like in the middle of the Caribbean. And to think about how expensive that must be to fill a bag with fresh water and then just drag it across an entire ocean to get it to an island, that's how desperate a lot of these places are and how much water they need. So I told you what's wrong with typical desalination, the harmful environmental impacts due to the brine and also the need for energy. But also they're really expensive to build, maintain, and especially expensive to operate because they require so much power. I was in St. Croix probably 4 or 5 months ago, and I was talking to a guy there so we pay about, here in Wilmington, we pay like a third of a tenth of a penny or something like that per gallon for water. They pay like 1.8 cents a gallon for water in the Bahamas. And as soon as you reach a certain water usage level, it jumps up to 2.4, and that's really quickly. So imagine paying 2.5 cents a gallon for water when you're taking a shower. So what this guy in St. Croix does is he's got his own desalination systems. And he's got 3 of them, and he's got a big house. It's like he calls it a plantation. It's not quite that big, but it's a large house. He's got 3 desalination systems. He makes about 3,500 gallons of water a day to water his grass and use in his house. He spends over $20,000 a year in electricity alone to make that much water. $20,000 a year. So if you can remove the need for electricity and replace it with, let's say, I don't know, free wave energy, the savings are incredible. So why wave energy? So we've all heard of, there's a bunch of different renewables out there, and the world is really making a shift towards renewable energy. Renewable energy is anything that is naturally occurring and kind of won't dissipate. So the common ones are wind and solar today. Solar is getting to be really popular. Rooftop solar now is actually will make economic sense without like tax incentives from the government. So you can actually generate power now with a solar panel on your roof that's competitive with what you buy from Duke Energy, which is pretty amazing. Wind energy, we've all seen wind turbines. Wind and solar are all really established. But what's cool about wave energy is that it's just so dense. So I'm assuming everyone in here has been in the ocean. You probably gotten knocked off your feet by a wave. I'm sure there's a lot of surfers in here, and you guys have been pounded a couple times. And we've all seen, at least videos of just huge ships being lifted in the air by a wave. And that just doesn't happen for free. There's a lot of energy in a wave that lifts this massive ship in the air. There's a lot of energy in waves. So a 2-foot Caribbean wave, just a small wave that can fit on this table, has about 3.5 times more energy in it than the same area of either a 20-mile-an-hour wind, it's about 6.5 times more energy, 7 times more energy than a 20-mile-an-hour wind, or about 3.5 times more energy dense than the best solar in the world. So I'm talking about like solar at the equator, dead noon with a clear sky. A 2-foot wave has 3.5 times more energy than that same area of solar. And that's one of the reasons we use waves. Also, we need seawater, and it just so happens that waves and seawater tend to be in the same place, which is pretty convenient. So this is our senior design team back at UNCC. That was the first system we built, which looks way different than the buoy you saw in the video. This was this crazy thing. It was like a pontoon boat, basically, with a huge pendulum on it. And this pendulum, these 2 black tubes here, were filled with just raw seawater to be heavy. And they weighed about, I think it was like 1,500 pounds. So whenever this whole pontoon boat would rock back and forth in the waves, this big heavy pendulum would swing back and forth, and it would drive pumps up at the top that would pressurize seawater and put it through what's called reverse osmosis. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But that was our first prototype, and after graduation, we worked with this one for probably a year, I think. And then what we realized is that was just too picky. Like it was really dependent on the size, the shape of a wave, and the frequency of a wave. So one of the things I was asking you when you were observing waves the other day at the beach, when we observe waves, there's a few things that really matter to us that we can record. We can go to the beach, we can watch waves, and then we can take certain stats from a wave, certain characteristics. We can plug it into a computer model, and we can simulate just how much we can calculate how much water our system can make. So we measure things like the wave amplitude or the wave height. We measure the period of the wave, which is basically like if you're standing in one spot and the wave passes, you start counting how many seconds does it take for the next wave to pass. We measure wavelength, which is very similar to period. It's the distance between 2 wave crests. And then given that information, we can do a lot of math and figure out what, actually it's not even that much math, really, it's pretty easy. Figure out how much water we can make. This thing had a really narrow sweet spot, I guess, that it like to run in. So we decided to ditch that, and we built this one. So this is SAROS version 2. And this is what's known in the wave energy world as a point absorber, which is basically, it's probably the simplest form of wave energy converter. It's a buoy that bobs up and down, and it uses the up and down motion of the ocean to do some sort of work for you, whether it's generate electricity or for us it's pumping water. How it works is the buoy gets anchored up just offshore, beyond breaking waves. We try to keep it out of the breaking stuff if we can help it. As a wave passes, it lifts this buoy up in the air. So remember that ship I was telling you about getting lifted in the air? That relies on buoyancy. There's just so much buoyant force in a wave. That's what we put to work for us. So this buoy is able to pull up on this mortar with about 1,800 pounds. So that's about, I don't know, a little more than half of the car you drove here. So that buoy lifts up on this mortar, pulls really hard on basically a bunch of weight that sits at the bottom, and then it uses that force to drive pumps. Those pumps suck in seawater, and then they pressurize it to about 200 psi. They send that 200 psi seawater back to shore into what's called a wave bank. So a wave bank is kind of like a battery. Waves are always different, as you know, so you can imagine like if you were just to hold the hose in your hand that came out of this buoy, this pump basically, every time a wave would pass, you'd get like a surge of water. The wave bank takes that surge of water, stores it, and then kind of outputs a smooth flow to our desalination system. So this wave bank is almost like if you were to take this water pump and hook it up to a balloon and then poke a hole in the balloon will absorb those surges, and a steady stream of water will come out of the other side of the balloon, through that little hole. From there it goes into what's called a pressure exchanger intensifier, which is a kind of a fancy component that it's almost like a transmission, I guess you could say, for water pressure. It takes this 200 psi water that we made, it takes a lot of it, and it turns it into 800 psi water at a lower flow. So to desalinate water using reverse osmosis, which using these membranes I'll tell you more about in a second, you need 800 psi, and that's why desalination is so energy intensive. So in your car tire you have about 35 psi in your car tire. 800 is what's needed to put this thing, to put water through this membrane. And then from there, so it goes into our membrane, and then out comes drinking water. Again, we use reverse osmosis, which I have a whole section further into the presentation about that I'll explain to you how it works. That's the wrong button. Alright, so again, since we're not using electricity, we're not using fossil fuels, it means that it's cheap and it's environmentally friendly. And what's really cool about, I guess, it being cheap is that because it's so much less expensive than what people are doing now, it means that we can put these buoys in places that couldn't afford desalination before. So there's so many more remote places that just don't have the money or even access to reliable energy to run a desalination system. With this buoy, they can pretty much just drop this thing off an island and start making water for them, drag and drop. So we moved back to Wilmington after spending 2 years in Charlotte. Why we moved back is pretty obvious, I would say. There's an ocean here, which is really handy. So it's great because it lets us test our system. Let me put it this way. When we were in Charlotte and we wanted to test our system, we planned like 2 weeks ahead of time. You know, we find a boat that we needed to use, we get a hotel room, all these things. And then a day before we decided to test, a thunderstorm would roll through. And then we'd just be like, well, shoot, we'd have to start all over again. So what's cool about this is Chris and I, the other guy in that video, we can sit in our office and like look out the window and be like, dude, it's nice out. Go on WB Live Surf and be like, it's pretty flat, we can probably get the buoy out right now, let's go. And we go. And so there's so much flexibility that comes with it. Wilmington has a pretty awesome growing business community. So while the buoy's out in the water being tested and we're gathering data, we're able to develop the business and figure out who to sell these to and how much to sell them for and where to find the money to keep building them and things like that. And then lastly, probably one of the coolest things about Wilmington is the atmosphere. Like I said in Charlotte, not many people have the ocean on their mind, but in Wilmington, I'd say the majority of people in this town kind of have salt water in their veins. And they just think that things like this, because it goes in the ocean, are just kind of interesting and cool. So there's been a lot of support and just interest, which goes a long way. A lot of encouragement, I guess you could say. A lot of people willing to help us out, so that's been really cool. So this is what we have coming up in the next, this is our next, I guess, big milestone. We're working with the town of Wrightsville Beach and hopefully Crystal Pier, although we haven't said anything to them yet, so don't give away the surprise. Because we want to make sure we have our ducks in a row first. But we'd love to put this buoy off of Crystal Pier over the winter, have a shed at the end of the pier. The buoy, like I said, sits off the pier and it pumps away and sends water back to the pier. And then in that shed is where our desalination equipment is. But what's really cool is on the outside of the shed we can have like signs and maybe like a little computer screen that can tell people, tell the public like, you know, what we're doing, who this can help, why the Crystal Pier is so awesome for letting us use the pier. And then like the screen can tell people like how much energy we're offsetting, how much water we're making, how many people that can support. Then we can take the water and we can use it for cool things to help engage the community, like a beach shower underneath the pier, or we've talked to some local breweries about making beer with the water that we make. So I think a lot of people in Wilmington that would be pretty excited about drinking beer that was made completely from waste. And we've talked to 3 breweries now, and they all want to do it, and they all want to like work together. So we have like a rotational thing going on where we take our water to different breweries all around town, and they all make their own version of beer. And we can have local artists like drop a cool label on the bottle, like a sea monster, I don't know. And just a cool way to spread the word about what we're doing and literally get the community firsthand involved with what we're up to. And at the same time for us, this pier project gives us a test site in our own backyard. Because there are problems we can solve now with short-term testing, but there are problems that are going to pop up in the future, like what happens if barnacles grow on our mooring line, or what happens when the UV rays from the sun start to deteriorate a certain part of the system. Those are all long-term effects that we need to figure out before we start selling these things, and this will let us do that. And it will be right in our own backyard, so we can literally within 10 minutes be right at the device and working on it if something goes wrong. We do have a test coming up with, the first time we actually make water will be with Jeanette's Pier, which is in Nags Head, North Carolina, up in the Outer Banks, if anybody's ever been there. Jeanette's Pier has, it's like the sweetest pier ever. It's really cool. It's this really long concrete pier. I think it's the longest one on the East Coast, the longest fishing pier on the East Coast. They have 3 wind turbines, which you might be able to see in that picture. They reuse like 97% of their water, which is just like insane. They have this really high-tech system underground that like recycles all the water that they use. The only thing they don't do is the reason they can't recycle all of it is because people don't want to drink toilet water out of a water fountain. They don't like the idea of like, you know, even though it's been treated and stuff, that happening. So anyway, they have a really cool system, and they also have a partnership with the University of North Carolina Coastal Studies Institute, or CSI is what they call it. They have 2 dedicated wave energy device test sites right up here, and there have been a couple companies, well, there have been 2 companies, us and then Resolute Marine Energy, since the conception of this wave energy program that tested here. And we want to, it's just really easy for us to make water on that pier at first, because the permitting we have to do at Riceville can take a long time. So that's coming up pretty soon with our latest prototype we're building now. And then we also have, next year we have 2 pilot projects. One is on Caja de Muertos, which is off of Ponce in Puerto Rico, which I'm really excited about. Puerto Rico is really cool. Yeah?
So whenever you were first trying to build it, like, I know that you said like the salt and like how like the animals are like, the animals that are like in the water, how would that like affect it? If the shark was like swimming towards it, or like the bird, pelican, and they were down and decide to like pick at it, because you said like the sun, the UVs would like destroy the tap water, hydrophilic system.
That's a fantastic question. That might be t-shirt worthy. So there are a lot of things like that there have been documentation on in the past. So we're not the first people to put a buoy in the ocean, which is great, because there's a lot of things that, believe it or not, there are like scholarly articles on buoys, which is like, you know, it seems like the simplest thing in the world. You'll have problems with, like we have a small solar panel on our buoy right now that powers our instrumentation, lets us send data back to shore so we can see what's going on. Birds doing their thing on that, you know, can block some solar panel area. Sharks and stuff, we'll probably never even know they're there. It's really funny. There's a lot of wave energy is this really environmentally friendly thing, but it's a new thing, and being new, it kind of scares a lot of environmentally friendly people, believe it or not. So you think, you know, people that are really into going green and stuff, like, wow, wave energy, it's like no fossil fuels, no carbon emissions, nothing. That's awesome. But instead, what a lot of people do is they're like, what if it makes a certain noise that gives it, like a crab a headache or something like that? You know, there's all these really specific, like, sometimes some of them are valid, some of them are like just sound absolute nuts. These really specific problems, which makes the permitting process a challenge. So environmental impact to local sea life is something that we know is not going to be a big issue, but it's something that has to be academically studied. And what's really cool is the wave energy industry is this growing industry that's in its infancy that's doing a lot of research right now to make the permitting process much more streamlined. So they're building this wealth of knowledge that they can then use to apply to wave energy systems all across the world. Because right now, like, I take this to Wrightsville Beach, and those guys are like, what the heck's a wave energy device? You know, like, where do we even begin to know how to permit this? And eventually what will happen is there will be like a prepackaged, almost like a form essentially. You can go through and check boxes and be like, does it do this, does it do this, does it do this? Fish and stuff like that, you know, people are like, man, that's, we put that right in the ocean. It's funny, fishermen, every single time we go to the boat ramp with this thing, they're like, hey man, where you put that thing? Because they want to fish around it. And when I dive on it, there's all these fish. I mean, it's like this whole ecosystem we've kind of created. It's fascinating. Like, you guys could go here and collect all kinds of samples. I mean, there's like little shrimp and what are those little Jack crevalles? Yeah, tons of those, and like all these cool critters like hanging out around this thing. And I think they like it. I mean, otherwise I don't think they'd be hanging out around it. Plankton and things like that, like more passive creatures, I guess, that can't, like, let's say we have an intake tube, right? It's got a filter on it, and because it's intaking water, there's some amount of current that's pulling things towards that filter. So if you're like a little plankton, you could theoretically get into a position where you couldn't swim faster than the current, you know, and you get sucked into it, which would be bad. So what we're doing is we're designing really cool intake methods that have really huge intake screens. And what that does is it lowers the velocity of the water coming in because it can be spread around the entire surface of the filter, which means that the things are able to swim away from it. It's called impingement and entrapment, the two kind of technical terms for something like this. So they're all things we're addressing and they're things we're figuring out. And I would say the plankton thing is probably the worst thing we could be doing right now, I guess. So anyway, so we have 2 pilot projects coming up, one in Puerto Rico, one at a hospital in Haiti next year. So that's pretty cool. And then how you can help, so I made this for like a completely different audience, but like I said, if you could share this on social media with all your friends, I think it's cool, that would be really helpful. Just spread the word. And if you know people that you think could be helpful to us, just people to know, let us know. Please, like, introduce us, that'd be awesome. If you're out there and you see a buoy that looks like this buoy that's just like floating free somewhere, to give us a call, keep a lookout, that would be helpful. But other than that, things we're looking for. This is the team. There's I guess you could say there's 3 of us full time. That would be Chris, myself, and Laura. Fred Wagner is this really cool guy that was the one that brought this idea to the school, to the university. He's like this wild entrepreneurial tinkerer, and he's kind of like he literally wears a lab coat to like work some days. But really cool guy, and he's just been, he's funded a lot of this, he's given us a lot of ideas, and he's really the reason that we're here. And then Sherry is an intern of ours, or a volunteer. She does a lot of our like blogging and communication to try to like spread the word about what we're doing. Carl's awesome. He has 30 years in business, which is something that none of us have. Coming from engineering school, there's a lot of business we have to learn. Carl's been a great mentor for that. So that's it about SAROS. So if anybody has SAROS specific questions, you can ask them now, or if you want to just roll right into desalination, we can do that. Yes?
When you go to Puerto Rico, like this spring, and like to Haiti,
No,
like
you can't come. I'm sorry.
are you immediately gonna start like giving that water that you make to people, or like what are you gonna do with the pilot?
Good question. So on Caja de Muertos, which is like this, it's like a park, like I want to call it a national park. It's a park, wildlife refuge off of Ponce. Actually, the name means Coffin Island, which is kind of cool. It looks like a coffin when you look at it from Ponce. It's really neat. Beautiful place, but they have no water right now. So they collect rainwater that they can use for like showering and things, but it's not potable, which means you can't drink it. So what they do is they bring all of their water with them, and the only people that live out there are about 10 park rangers who live out there full time, and they're on a week-long rotation, so they have to bring all their water with them for the rotation. We're going to put this buoy out there, and literally start pumping water in a tank for them, and it's going to be hooked up to their water infrastructure that goes into their houses and stuff like that, so they can turn a faucet and start using the water. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So how do third world countries feed and stuff pay for the soda? Are they
That's a fantastic question. That's a really good. All right, so that's great. So you're right. A lot of these places don't have a whole lot of money to afford things like this, especially new technologies. So what we're planning to do from a business perspective is we're going to start by catering to like, well, I'll start by saying our pilot projects are things that we're either going to pay for by crowdfunding, or we're going to pay for it by working with, like, we're in the Colorado 80 project right now, which is a nonprofit aid organization to help get these fresh pilot projects in place. And that's, aid organizations will be absolutely critical in helping finance these projects. Because I mean, a system that makes 5,000 gallons a day is probably going to be about $35,000, which in the grand scheme of things is really cheap, and especially when you factor in the cost of electricity that you're saving. But for a small village, they don't have $35,000. So our plan as a business is to start out by selling to like island resorts and things like that. Especially there are a number of like eco-friendly resorts we've talked to that would love to like put this basically on their menu of eco-friendly amenities that can appeal to their eco-friendly tourists. We'll start with them, and then that'll actually give us like a viable business that's self-sustaining, I guess you could say, in order to prove the technology. Once the technology is proven, then we start leaning more on aid organizations to help get these to places. So like, World Water, USAID, places like that, who these organizations are nonprofits that are generally more hesitant to spend money on new technologies that don't have a proven track record, because if it screws up, the people that give them money regularly are going to lose trust in them and stop funding them. So we have to prove ourselves before we can start working with aid organizations. But the aid organizations are how we're going to get these things to those less developed places. We've also thought about like a nonprofit structure. So like this needs a lot more thinking, but like Tom's Shoes, how like when they sell a pair of shoes, they give a pair to somebody that needs them. We've thought about things like that. And obviously it wouldn't be like we sell a SAROS boot, we give a SAROS boot to somebody else. We'd more like sell 20 SAROS boots and we give a SAROS boot to someone else or something like that, just because these are a lot more expensive than a pair of shoes to make. But that's another thing we've thought about as well. Yeah?
So would you like bottle this water and stuff like that after you made it?
No. We would put this into like a cistern, and then we would, I shouldn't just jump so quickly and say no. We would not bottle the water. If somebody wants to put the water in a bottle, if they need to get it to a place that maybe they don't have a pipe running to, they could do that. But essentially, our work is going to, at least in the beginning, is going to stop once the water gets into the tank. We'll put the water into a cistern, and then many places, not all places, it really depends on the place, I guess is a better way to answer this. Some places have pretty developed distribution systems for the water, so like here, you can put it in a water tower and it just comes out of your faucet when you turn the valve. Some places are going to need to transport the water to their homes and places like that because they don't have pipes right through their house. So it really depends on where it goes. But we won't actually like be bottling water and then selling bottles.
Oh.
We're a machine that makes water, and then whatever comes out of the hose, they can do what they need to with it, I guess. Yeah. It could be, yeah. So like I said, it really depends on the place. It could be literally a tank in the center of a village, and people will like walk up there and have almost like a beer tap or something that they use to fill up a jug of water. It could be literally just right to their house into a distribution system. It really, really depends. That guy on St. Croix I was telling you about, he's got it right plumbed into his distribution system. So he's got a holding tank, and then he's got like a solar-powered pump, which is pretty cool, that just maintains water pressure. It turns on a faucet, it just runs out of the tank and into his house. So it really depends on what the people that are using it have in place.
Are you gonna cover how much it can make per day, or is that very?
That's something I always forget to cover, yeah. So the prototype that you guys saw, that picture that was on the presentation and the one that's in the video, the buoy's about this big around, and that's designed to make about 400 or 500 gallons in 2-foot waves. So, and that's a day, 400 or 500 gallons a day in 2-foot waves. As the waves get bigger, obviously, so 4-foot waves, that just about doubles. So now we're making about 800 gallons a day with that same system. But what's cool about this latest design is that it scales really favorably. So if we make the buoy, we take it from 5 feet diameter to 6 feet diameter, all of a sudden we can go from 500 gallons a day to like 3,500 gallons a day in the same waves. So there will be a point at which, can I draw here?
Yeah.
There will be a point at which like the buoy is going to get so large that it won't work right, and that's what we're studying right now. We have a grant with the University of Colima in Mexico to study this. But say these are waves. These are really pretty perfect waves. I wish waves really looked like this in real life. Eventually, our buoy, right now it sits on top of a wave and then it drops into the trough of a wave. But eventually the buoy could become so big that it starts to just like sit across 2 crests of a wave and like straddle a wave. And when that happens, we made the buoy too big. So we need to make it smaller, and then then you can group them together in an array. Just like you'd see like a wind farm, you never see, well, I can't say never, but rarely do you see like one wind turbine in a field. You know, there's a whole bunch of them. You never see one solar panel on someone's roof. You probably won't see one, depending on how much water people need, you probably won't see one SAROS buoy in a town. You know, you'll probably have a group of them. Yes?
I have a question. So if it was like made almost like flexible to go with the waves, would it be made bigger?
It could, but so that's a different type of wave energy device. And when we get to the wave energy section, we'll go over that. There are a bunch of different cool designs that are out there. Yeah?
So does that mean like you said how in 2 foot waves it makes like setting out would like if you're having a really big hurricane like a lot of waves, a lot of like choppy waves, would it make more water?
It would. So yeah, it would definitely make, I mean, the bigger the wave, in theory, the bigger the wave, the more water it's going to make, because there's just more energy in a bigger wave. The more this buoy moves up and down, the more water we make. Hurricanes, what will likely happen is the system is going to be designed, just because it would be really expensive to build in this extra capacity into the system. The system would be designed to probably plateau at a certain wave height, so say, 10 or 12 feet is probably where it maxes out the capacity of these membranes, these filters, and they just can't accept any more flow unless you were to put another one. And because you rarely see those conditions, it might not make sense from a cost perspective to put another one in there. So what will happen then is just extra water pressure is just going to be pulling off like out of the valve. Basically, it would be like a safety valve that just purges extra pressure. So most of the water flow will be going into the membranes, but anything that is too much for these membranes to handle is just going to get blasted back out into the ocean. Good question. Desalination time? Alright, so 97% of the water in the world is in the oceans. That's a whole lot of water. There's like a ton, I googled like the other day, surprisingly I just did this the other day, but googled how much water is in the oceans, and it was this number that's just like, you can't even say it. It's got like a whole bunch of like decimal places and exponents, it's just ridiculous. There's so much water in the oceans. And maybe not here, but in a lot of places, water is like a super scarce thing. Why not pull water from this like unlimited supply we have from the oceans? And the answer is because it takes a whole lot of energy to do that. So if we can use waves to do it for us, we can probably have really good access to this kind of water in a lot of places. So 97% of the ocean, or of the world, water is oceans, in the oceans. 2%, a little over 2% is locked up in ice caps and glaciers, and about less than 1% is available fresh water. So less than 1% of all the water in the world is something that is fresh water, not even drinkable water necessarily, but like something in a lake, So there's a whole lot of ocean water out there, and there's not a whole lot of fresh water. I don't know, I'm not even going to talk about that next one because that doesn't really apply. It's groundwater, but I guess there's a tiny bit of water in lakes, swamps, and rivers. A lot of groundwater. We'll skip that. This is Huntington Beach. I thought this was a cool picture. You got some guys catching some waves, and then you have this big desal plant in the background. This is in California. That's what a large-scale desalination plant looks like. I think that this is a thermal desalination plant, which we'll talk about a little bit, judging by the stacks that are on here, unless that's a power plant. A lot of times they build desalination plants next to power plants, which is actually pretty cool because, say a power plant is already there, it needs to be there. A perfect example would be like the one in Southport, the nuclear power plant in Brunswick. It generates a whole lot of heat, and that's kind of like a byproduct. And if you've ever been in Southport and you've seen those canals that kind of run through Southport, like there's a couple bridges where you're going to like cross over this weird, like really straight canal, if anybody's ever seen that. And what that is that the power plant sucks in river water, uses the river water to cool the plant, and then this warmer water then comes out of the plant, and they run it through these canals to let it kind of cool down a little bit, then they pump it out offshore out in front of Oak Island. And that's just what needs to happen for a power plant right now. They need to take out, it's called residual heat removal. Desalination, there's a few ways you can desalinate water. You can use this membrane, or you can just simply boil water. And if you could use that waste heat from a power plant to boil water, that's a pretty cool use of it, because otherwise it's just something you're going to throw away. So a lot of times we see power plants built right next to desalination plants, and the desal plants will use the waste heat. It's the same way they, like in the Navy on submarines, they have nuclear submarines, they'll use the heat from the reactor to run a distillation system which boils water, and that's how they make water for themselves on the submarine. So there are three main types of desalination: thermal, mechanical, and then electrical ion exchange. Thermal is really simple. Thermal is just you're boiling water, and you get like steam, right? That's water vapor that comes off. So think you're making ramen, and you lift up the lid of the pot, and there's all those like water droplets on the lid. That's all like really clean water. And if you can collect that really clean water, you can drink it. So that's how thermal desalination works. By basically boiling water and collecting the vapor. You can also use vacuum distillation, which, did you know you can boil water at room temperature? Does anybody know how? What's that? Yeah, reverse pressure. So like vacuum. So if I were to take her bottle of water right here, and I were to hook a vacuum pump up to it, this thing would probably crush before this happened, but this water could just start to boil right here on the table because you're taking out the air pressure that's pushing down on the water and kind of holding it all together, and the water will just kind of fall apart almost and boil right there at room temperature. That's a way that some people can desalinate water, by just basically hooking a vacuum up to a bunch of water, and then it boils at room temperature, and you collect the vapor, and you have water. Mechanical means these are basically membrane-based methods, which are like reverse osmosis, forward osmosis. This is a little weird, so ion exchange uses a membrane, but we'll pretend that's not there. But basically, these mechanical means use a membrane. And I'm going to pass these around in a second. The next slide shows how membranes work. And these membranes are essentially like molecular-sized filters, basically. So you have salt molecules, which are kind of big and bulky. Water molecules are a little smaller and they're attached. Salt really likes to be with water, which is the reason it takes so much energy to separate them. And if you force really high-pressure seawater into this membrane, that pressure through reverse osmosis causes the salt bonds to be ripped, or the salt to be ripped apart from the water molecules, and water molecules can permeate through this membrane, and collects in the center as fresh water, and you get clean water out. So I'll get into more detail about that in a second. I'll pass these around. And then the last kind, which this is more of like a lab technology, I'd say, like lab scale experimental technology still at this point. I mean, there's some places that kind of use it, but electrical means could be ion exchange or electrodialysis, where salt has a charge. Salt is an ion, so if you put voltage in water, you can cause salt to kind of want to be over on this side of a vessel, a container, I guess you could say, and the fresh water stays on this side. So you can actually attract salt molecules away from water using electrical charge. Not super commonplace. Basically magic, yeah. That's what I've just said, like literally all those words I said, that's it. I don't know anything else about that one. So it's basically magic, and it's not super commonplace at this point. So reverse osmosis. Did you guys talk about like osmosis in biology? Yeah, so it's like how liquids permeate through a cell membrane, and it's because a liquid of higher concentration, if you have a liquid of high concentration, like here, there's a whole lot of stuff, we'll call it salt, in this side, and then you have low concentration, there's less salt on this side. This stuff these two concentrations want to even out just by osmotic pressure. So the salt wants to pass through this membrane and balance out the two solutions, and that's called osmotic pressure. And in the case of seawater, that's about 400 psi. So actually, just putting two different concentrations of water on either sides of the membrane, there's like 400 psi differential pressure in between that membrane that it's trying to keep the two apart. It's really crazy. So reverse osmosis is, as it sounds, the reverse of that. So if we have a lot of salt here on this side, say seawater, and we have fresh water here, and we have this membrane, and you push really hard with like 800 psi, you can overcome that 400 psi differential pressure that's trying to push everything the other way, and you can actually separate salts out in the reverse direction. So the easiest way to think about it is like molecular filtration, but it's chemically a little more advanced than that. And quite honestly, it's kind of over my head how the chemistry in this thing works. So this is a reverse osmosis membrane, so I'll pass these around. These are membranes. These are literally exactly what we found on like a yacht. So a lot of like high-end boats will have water makers. A lot of sailors that go out on like long trips, they go and bring their water with them. They'll have water makers on board. I think this is a 150-gallon-a-day membrane. Each one of these are, so I'll pass these around if you guys want to see them. But what happens is you feed water into this, into one end of the membrane. There's these like holes here. This one's kind of wet, but there's holes here. You pack in a whole bunch of seawater into this side, and then water makes its way down the membrane. There's a spiral wound element, and then each of these spirals are different layers of membrane that fresh water is able to permeate through. And basically, it's like a sandwich. So say this is one leaf of a membrane. So fresh water passes through this membrane, and it actually makes it into the center of this layer. And then from the center of this layer, it actually spirals all the way around until it gets into the center tube. That's where the fresh water comes out. So if you were to hook this up to a real system, you put feed water, seawater in this end, you get your fresh water out of this end, and then out of these holes, you get your brine. So as the water passes, as the water enters here and it passes down the membrane, fresh water starts to seep out through these membrane leaves. And by the time that seawater gets to the end, a lot of the fresh water is gone. So this is where your salty water comes out. I forget what material the membranes are made out of, but essentially it's crazy how they make these things. You have a few different parts to the membrane. You have the actual membrane itself, which has a paper clip on it in this one. Then you have what are called feed spacers, which are like these meshy kind of materials. Feed channel spacer that's like mesh that allows the water to like kind of work its way around the membrane and cover membrane area. And then you have a permeate spacer, which is like kind of the pathway for permeate connection. It's a pathway between the two membrane sides that allows the clean water to travel through to the center tube of the membrane. So you guys can check these out as well if you want to see them.
Is that the size of the ones you have in the buoy?
The ones that we're going to be running in the latest buoy are 40 inches. I think it's just one. So these are 2.5 by 14-inch membranes. The ones we're going to be running in the latest one are 2.5 by 40. So it's the same diameter, but it's about 40 inches long.
Uh-huh.
How long is this thing? 36.
And how long
How long
are
is this?
they good for?
If you treat them properly, they're good for about 5 years.
Oh, wow.
We're not going to treat them really great, just the way our system runs, so we may get 3 years out of them. They're not super expensive, so those membranes right there are about $150. So you can get 3 years out of $150. It makes economic sense still. And how you treat them well is you just remove a lot of the junk that's in the seawater before you can get to the membrane. So we have pre-filters that remove sediment and things like that, plankton, whatever, you know, that, like sand before it gets into the membrane. Yeah.
So whenever whenever the 3 years is up, do you replace all of them? Like all of the membranes inside the buoy, or you just get
So the membranes, so on our system, the membranes are on land. The only thing that's out in the ocean is the pump, and that's kind of the engine for the process, which is cool because when you replace the membranes, you don't have to have a guy go out there with a probe to switch them out. But yeah, you just take 2 screws out, pop the cap off, and then those things slide out of this like tube, and you just swap new cartridges in.
So when you guys don't have like a certain model, but like how long are those buoys good for? Are they good for like a long time? Or you have
So each buoy is, good question, each buoy is designed, we're designing them to last about 10 years, and that's kind of like what we're basing the economics of the system around. That's because we need to know how long it will last in order to figure out how much our water costs basically, because if you have to replace the buoy halfway through it makes it more expensive. So our buoys are designed to last about 10 years, and they'll probably need like a biannual, like every 2-year kind of overhaul where you replace a couple components on it. Simple stuff. So we're making sure that we design the buoy so that it's like ultra simple. If the part doesn't need to be on the buoy, we're putting it on land. So the only things that are on the buoys, they're there because they need to be there, and anything that needs to be worked on can be fixed by anybody. That's really like a strong focus that we're trying to make with this. On the pre-filters, those would probably need to be replaced depending on the turbidity of the water, which means how stirred up and how much sediment is in the water. Those need to be replaced maybe every 3-ish months or something like that. Those cost like $2 for a whole new set. This is a large-scale desalination plant to kind of walk you through the process. So you have the ocean, and then you have intake tubes that suck in seawater. They go through like a strainer, which basically just removes like sticks and stuff like that, you know, so you're not sucking in like seagrass. And then they put that water into a settlement tank, or settling tank, which is just literally like almost like a swimming pool, where the water is just allowed to sit at very low current, and sediment just kind of falls out of suspension, so you get like this mud at the bottom of it. And every now and then you have to go in there with a bulldozer, drain it and hose it out, and you drain out all the sediment. But what that does is it allows just sand and stuff to fall out of it. Also, this is how a large-scale plant works. This isn't how, we don't have a settling tank in our system. Then from the settling tank, you run it through sand filters, which is just like a swimming pool we use. Then it goes into, these are diatomaceous surface filters. Not too many, I mean those aren't super common, but basically these things are to remove sediment from the seawater. Then it gets pumped over here to a really high pressure pump, goes through more filters, excuse me, and then into the reverse osmosis membrane. So a lot of plants you won't see one membrane, look at that. You won't see one membrane. In that Carlsbad plant, I think they have like 20,000 membranes in that thing. It's crazy. So you'll see banks of membranes. The seawater goes into these membranes, and then it's separated out into freshwater. So these tubes are the freshwater that go into like post-treatment in the holding tank. The post-treatment might be like it gets a little bit of chlorine, So like city water has a tiny bit of chlorine in it just to keep it sanitary. They may actually remineralize it in some cases. Because sometimes reverse osmosis, if you run it right, or I guess if you run it wrong, the water can be so clean that it doesn't have any minerals or anything in it, and that can actually, they call it aggressive water, and what that means is that if you put it in a pipe, the water wants those minerals so bad it'll steal them from the pipe, and then the pipe will start to fall apart. And that's actually part of what happened in Flint, Michigan, with that water thing they had. They had water, they had mineral leaching, and then they tried to fix it by injecting this other chemical, and they put too much of this chemical or something like that, mess things up. But anyways, that's what a post-treatment would look like, and then you got your fresh water here. But this is something cool that I wanted to mention. So this is called energy recovery. This is an energy recovery turbine. This is really sweet. So like I said, you maybe have, of all the water that comes into the membrane, maybe 20% might come out as fresh water. 80% of it now is 800 psi seawater, that because it's at 800 psi, it still contains a lot of energy. And otherwise you would just blast that back out into the ocean and waste that energy. What an energy recovery turbine does is it takes that high pressure exhaust basically, that waste product, and it uses it to spin a turbine, which generally will help push this pump along in the beginning. So it helps, it uses the pressure that's still in like the waste product to help move along the pump that builds new pressure. So like recycles energy. Very similar, like if anybody knows how a turbocharger works in a car, it uses like waste exhaust gas to help pump new air into the engine. It's kind of the same thing for reverse osmosis. And with this, you can boost efficiency, like almost, you can quadruple, sometimes factors of 6 increase your efficiency. We have energy recovery in our system, which is really, really sweet. So, all right, cool. How much time do we have left? 30 minutes?
Well,
Not quite?
not quite. Bell rings at 8:29 now.
Okay. Well, then we'll go right into ocean energy then, because this is really cool. It's probably my favorite part of the whole presentation. This is what ocean energy looks like. So you may look at the ocean, you may not think that like there's like energy in there, because a lot of people think energy is like electricity. But energy comes in all kinds of forms. You probably learn in like physics and things. You can have like thermal energy, electrical energy, you can have kinetic energy, and potential energy. Energy is all these different weird forms. And in this case, that's energy, and that's just moving water. And think about like a hydroelectric dam, how they take moving water from a river and they turn that into, use it to spin a turbine and generate power. Kind of the same process with ocean energy, but they can use the motion of waves and tides in different ways to spin a generator or to move pumps and things like that. So there are 3 main types of ocean energy. Tidal, pretty self-explanatory. It uses the ebbing and flowing of the tides basically to, generally they would spin like a turbine, like a wind turbine. So you think a wind turbine just uses air current to spin a big fan. You can use tidal current to spin an underwater fan and generate power. So it's really similar to like traditional hydropower. Wave energy uses the kinetic energy of ocean waves, the motion of ocean waves. That's what we use for our system. So waves are generally oceans, almost always moving, and there's kinetic energy there that you can harvest and put to work for you. And then there's ocean thermal energy conversion, or OTEC, which it generates energy based on the temperature differential. So you guys talked about like thermoclines, probably. I learned that word in third class. There's a big temperature differential between deep cold water and warm surface water, and believe it or not, there's actually a way to get energy out of that, which is also kind of like magic, and I'll go through that in a second too. So there's challenges to ocean energy. Obviously, I said ocean industry. The ocean energy industry is kind of in its infancy, and it's technology still being developed. Just like we're out in front of Mason Bear Iron Out wrinkles with our buoy, people are doing the same thing with their technology. So corrosion is an issue. Storm survivability is an issue. There's biological things that are an issue, like the barnacles and the environmental impacts that need to be studied. Cost and economics, those are big issues right now because, so for like corrosion, if you can make everything out of stainless steel on your device, it would last forever. But that's really expensive. And if you make everything out of stainless steel and your machine's really expensive, there's no way that you're going to make, the power that you're generating is cost effective because your machine is just so ridiculously expensive to make that way. Predictability is one that people are working with. Predictability is an advantage to tides because tides are very predictable. Tides, come, do 4 tides a day, 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day, and they're really predictable. Like my watch will tell you what tide it is, and it's not like connected to Wi-Fi or anything. It's just because it knows what the tides are supposed to do. Where waves aren't very predictable, so waves are always changing. And that's a challenge because if somebody needs a lot of power and there's no waves, they have to find some other way to generate it. And then permitting in the unknown, that's kind of the thing I was talking about with, they just don't know the effects of some of these just yet. So, like I said, I doubt there are going to be any serious effects. And people just don't know what any effects would be. So tidal power, I'll play this video. Take a breather. That's it. This is what your stereotypical like tidal power concept would look like. It's basically an underwater wind turbine.
Tidal power. Tidal power is a form of hydropower that converts the energy from the natural rise and fall of the tides into electricity. Tides are caused by the combined effects of gravitational forces exerted by the moon, the sun, and the rotation of the earth. Tidal plants can only be installed along coastlines. Coastlines often experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides on a daily basis. The difference in water levels must be at least 5 meters high to produce electricity. Tidal electricity can be created from several technologies, the main ones being tidal barrages, tidal fences, and tidal turbines. Tidal barrages are the most efficient tidal energy sources. A tidal barrage is a dam that utilizes the potential energy generated by the change in height between high and low tides. This energy turns a turbine or compresses air, which in turn creates electricity. Tidal fences are turbines that operate like giant turnstiles, whereas tidal turbines are similar to wind turbines, only underwater. In both cases, electricity is generated when the mechanical energy of tidal currents turns turbines connected to a generator. The generator produces electricity. Ocean currents generate relatively more energy than air currents because ocean water is 832 times more dense than air and therefore applies greater force on the turbines. Tidal power is easy to install and renewable, having no direct greenhouse gas emissions and a low environmental impact. Because the ocean's tidal patterns are well understood, tidal energy is a very predictable energy source, making it highly attractive for electrical grid management. This sets it apart from other renewables that can be more unpredictable. However, adoption of tidal technologies has been slow, and so far the amount of power generated using tidal power plants is very small. This is due largely to the very specific site requirements necessary to produce tidal electricity. Additionally, tide cycles do not always match the daily consumption patterns of electricity, and therefore do not provide sufficient capacity to satisfy demand. That's tidal power.
Tidal power. Do you still hear anything? Sorry, I probably blasted your eardrums out and turned down a tiny bit. So that's tidal power. It's very similar to wind, but it's kind of like underwater wind power. Like I said, an advantage is predictability. That has a huge advantage. I mean, economically, it actually makes a lot of sense because the way power grids work. I can explain that in a second. But the disadvantage to tidal is that they set these really specific site requirements. So here in Wrightsville, we have maybe a 6-foot tide. Would you agree? Something like that, or something like that? It really depends on the moon phase and stuff. So there are places like in the Caribbean that have a 6-inch tide. And so tidal power doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So places, I know a company that designed a tidal system in the Bay of Fundy.
I was gonna say, but if I'm
Yeah.
gonna handle
Which is just near the Bay of Fundy, so that's got like a 30-foot tidal,
50-foot,
50-foot tidal range. So that's insane. So man, that's the one like where boats. Did you guys
yeah.
learn about that? Where like the boats will sit there and then all of a sudden they're 30 feet of water or whatever. So you can imagine there's just a lot of energy moving in and out of that bay. And they put a tidal installation in the Bay of Fundy. But that's been the biggest drawback against the tidal is that it's difficult to find the right conditions. You need a huge tidal range to make economic sense. And you also need like the right kind of geography. It's nice to have a place that like kind of bottlenecks. Going too far. So that's tidal. No. What did I do? Okay. So this is ocean thermal energy conversion. This is the next. I guess not skip a slide, but this is the next one we'll talk about. And this is the one that's kind of like magic. It uses the temperature differential found in the deep oceans and shallow oceans to generate power. So this one's kind of wild. So remember how I said like water can boil at room temperature if it's under a vacuum? Well, there are things that you could fill that water bottle with that would just boil away right now, even if there was no vacuum. So like ammonia byproducts are a good example, like refrigerant that's in air conditioners. This kind of works like, it shares very similar concepts with how like a refrigerator works, which is called vapor compression refrigeration, or like an air conditioning system in your car. It uses a fluid, so you see this purple loop here? This purple loop is filled with a fluid that will actually boil at room temperature. So like a refrigerant, like ammonia, things like that. And what they do is they use warm seawater. They use warm seawater and they pump this fluid through this warm heat exchanger, which causes the fluid to boil and expand, and it basically turns into ammonia steam, essentially. That ammonia steam runs through a turbine, and it spins the turbine to generate power, and then they take that warm, I don't want to say hot, but warm ammonia steam, and then they cool it down by using cold seawater that's pumped up from the deep ocean. And then that condenses it back down into a liquid, and then the cycle begins again where they pump that cooler ammonia back into a warm heat exchanger, boil it essentially, and then spin a turbine. This one's really cool. So I guess there's a plant in Hawaii, which I just learned about when I saw this video last night. But it's still not widely adopted as of yet. I think I'm gonna skip through a lot of this video. That's what the plant looks like. I really like these guys' shirts.
Energy, especially
They wear Hawaiian shirts.
to
I mean, it's
benefit mankind, being able to provide
This
more
company's
than
called Mackay
100%
Engineering.
total
They're in
energy
Hawaii.
needs of the planet, and be able to do it with no carbon imprint is a worthwhile goal.
So
fluids from mixing, separating the ammonia from the seawater.
this is a heat
So
exchanger,
now we're
which
at
is
the
basically a
top of the
radiator
heat
in your car,
exchangers that are
essentially.
called evaporators. What's coming out is high pressure ammonia vapor. So the warm seawater has gone into the heat exchanger and heated up that ammonia. It's boiled it. So now it becomes really high pressure steam. How do you boil a fluid with warm seawater? It's at room temperature. So how does it boil anything? And the answer to that is you pick a fluid that has a low boiling point. So in our case, we use a refrigerant, and it can actually boil and become very high pressure at room temperature. You take a low temperature heat source, creates a high pressure that propels through a pipe and comes into the turbine case right here. It spins the turbine, and that rotational motion is ultimately what powers the plant. That turbine is connected to a generator over here, and that's where we get the power. This is what's connected to the grid.
After the vapor leaves the turbine, we need to convert it back into a liquid. And so we do that in the condensers. The vapor comes down through this pipe inside this chamber, where there's hundreds of little tubes inside this big tube. And the cold seawater passes through these little tubes, and on the outside of them, the ammonia senses the cold, and then it's converted into a liquid and drips down to the bottom where it continues the cycle.
The waters around Hawaii are very stable in terms of temperature, and that allows us to extract a very steady source of power year-round. It's utility-grade electricity, so it doesn't need an inverter, it doesn't need to be filtered.
So that's OTEC, Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion. I don't know why this one. Get out of here.
Take that and try it.
Cool, thank you. So that's Ocean Thermal Energy Conversion. Yeah.
Okay, so where do they get the freeze the purpose of
The ammonia or refrigerant. Where do they get it?
Yeah, or how does it mean to like, even though like it has a low boiling point, so how they know they're like, hey, you can just plug this in and it'll easily do that.
How do they know to do that?
Yeah.
Engineering. That's where like engineering comes. So there's within mechanical engineering there's a section of that called thermodynamics, which talks about heat transfer and things just like this, about how like pressure and temperature are related and different working fluids and things like that. So this kind of concept of things boiling at room temperature has been around for a long, long time. That's how we've always, that's what's in your refrigerator in your house. It's what's in your air conditioner. So they're just really clever, I guess, and whoever thought of this concept, it's really cool. It's very stable, which again is a really attractive thing as far as renewable energy is concerned, because like you said, they have really consistent water temperatures. But it does take some pretty specific requirements. So like it would never work in the Caribbean because it's too shallow there, and they don't see those huge temperature differentials like they would like in Hawaii. Hawaii like drops off and it just plummets like thousands of feet, I think. So they can find really large temperature gradients which make this work. Yeah, you have a question?
Kind of integrate. So it would only be able, like this system would only work in places that have like all warm water and not all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, you have to have cold at the bottom and warm at the top all the time. If you don't have those two things, it simply won't work. Just like people ask us like about our buoy, like, so if there's no waves, does it still work? No, it doesn't. those are like things you have to have. And in Hawaii, they have so that kind of narrows unfortunately, kind of narrows the geographic applications of this, I guess, to only a handful of places in the world, maybe. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of places in the world, but it really limits where this can be utilized. Because you have to have warm surface water and you have to have really cold deep water for this to work. Guys ready to talk about wave energy? Alright, wave energy. My favorite. This is a really cool picture. I thought this was pretty rad. This is a company called Polemis, and they're out of business now, unfortunately, due to the what happened in like 2008 and stuff like that. And there was a big pullback from renewable energy technologies from investors.
That's okay, that's
That's when the normal people get here. That's
when
the
the normal
overachievers.
people can come in too.
So anyway, this is a really cool one. This is called an attenuator. I'll talk more about these different types, but this is almost like a sea snake, and it's a pretty sweet looking device. And it's kind of like what you were kind of getting at, I think, like what if you made it flexible, so it fit between waves. That's kind of what this system does. So one of the reasons I really love what I do is because when I was in engineering school, my biggest fear was like sitting in a cubicle all day long and like filling out a spreadsheet on why this doorknob will not break or something like that over and over and over for the rest of my life. I was really scared of like the stereotypical monotony that you might think of when you think of engineering. Wave energy industry is like the Wild West. It's just crazy. Like there's so many cool things out there, and nobody's really figured out the silver bullet yet, the magic answer. So, like now you see wind turbines out there, and they all have 3 blades. They all look identical. They can be from a completely different manufacturer from the other side of the world, but they'll look pretty much the same. Wave energy devices, as you can tell, they're not that way. So there's just so much cool innovation happening. This first one here this is the Polemis device. It's called an attenuator. It's like a sea snake. It's got as waves pass, it does like kind of this flexing motion, and they have hydraulic cylinders in between the joints of this thing that as it flexes, they use those to pump water back and forth, or hydraulic oil. Then they use the hydraulic oil to spin a turbine, which makes power. This is called the Oyster. And also, one thing to note, look at how massive these things are. There's nobody standing there, but that thing is huge. That thing is obviously huge. There's a guy there standing next to it. These are really big devices. This is called a surge device, and this is like a hinged flap that sits on the seafloor. As a wave passes, this flap kind of does this, And again, there's these big hydraulic cylinders right there and right there that as that flap kind of moves back and forth, it pumps hydraulic fluid through a turbine. Actually, a professor that we're working with at UNCW, he's in the environmental science department, did a lot of the environmental impact studies for this device right here in Portugal, which is kind of cool. He's a really cool guy. I'll say these 3 are pretty similar. These are all called point absorbers, which is like what our buoy is. And a point absorber is a system that just bobs up and down. It's like the simplest form of wave energy converter. And what's cool about a point absorber is it doesn't care which direction the waves are coming from. It doesn't care the shape of the wave too much. It just wants to move up and down. If it's doing that, it's going to do work. So these are point absorbers that are fixed to land, and as a wave kind of comes up towards the shore, it lifts these big floats, and they drive hydraulic cylinders here, big pumps. This one is kind of similar to our system. It's got a big thing called a heave plate down here, which is like an underwater parachute that as it rises and falls, it pulls against the parachute and drives a pump that's almost like a bicycle pump. If you think like a bicycle pump that you use to pump up a bike tire, imagine if you like strapped a bicycle pump to the ocean floor and then hooked a float up to it. So as this thing bobbed up and down, it was moving the pump. That's kind of how this one works. And the same with this one. This is a submerged point absorber. It's called a submerged pressure differential point absorber. And these are really cool because when you look at it from the surface, you see nothing. Like ships and stuff can go right over these things, and they're completely hidden. The downside to these systems is everything's underwater. So if you want to service them, or we said when you have to service them, it's really expensive. The approach we've taken with SAROS is to keep everything that's important above water. Anything you'd ever have to touch with a wrench or change, or could really corrode, we want to keep above the surface of the water. But with these systems, they have a bladder in here. Yeah, it's like a rubber bladder. It's really crazy with some air. And as a wave passes, the pressure increases as the depth of the water increases over this thing, and it causes this whole buoy to sink. And then as the wave moves away, it causes it to float again, and it just does this up and down motion that drives pumps. This is called a Sea Dragon. This was designed by, like, I think it was a Japanese company that built this a long time ago. This is a, it's an oscillating water column device is what it's called. So there's this chamber in here. As a wave passes, water rushes in this chamber and it fills the chamber up. And what that does is as the chamber fills up, it forces the air that was then in the chamber out through this turbine, and it spins the turbine. So it's like kind of like wind energy, but the wind is kind of generated by waves coming in and out of that chamber. So this is the last one I had. I just had a video that kind of talks about wave energy. So if there's any questions, we can start them right now because I'm going to run up to the bell, or if I'm going to stop
Let's
right
answer the questions first.
Yeah.
First question, did the things that you guys showed, do they have to like go through a small calibration before they like start actually camping?
The things that, like
Like
you
the water, they have to have like a small calibration of like, okay, so I know the waves are gonna do this, so like the intake is gonna be this much.
I see what you're saying, like the whole device itself, the whole thing. That's an interesting, I have an interesting answer for that. So a lot of wave energy companies right now are really trying to get extremely precise and academic with their devices. So they're doing a lot of wave tank testing, and they really want to fine tune specific devices to specific places. That's really expensive. Our approach to do all that research, to have a different model for every situation, basically, to have this ultra refined system that we have, you know, PhDs from MIT spending thousands of hours analyzing how it moves in waves. That's really pricey, and because of that, nobody's really had a successful wave energy system yet. Because they build these things in labs, and then they immediately try to go from this lab prototype, and they think they know everything about it now. They build this giant device, and then a shackle or something breaks on the huge device, and it costs them more to tow their device in than it does for our company to have existed for 3 years. Because they try to make these huge leaps because they think they have a huge understanding. Our philosophy is we want this thing to just be simple, robust, rugged, and it's really universal. So there would be no fine-tuning basically for our system. So we would look at the average wave amplitude, the max and the min, see what the biggest waves that place may see over 50 years. And then we make sure that we just have enough travel to accommodate that so the system doesn't just like break away if a huge wave comes. But other than that, there's very little refinement, I'd say, and they're pretty much a one-size-fits-all or more of a modular approach is what we're taking. So if somebody needs more water, instead of designing a new system, we just drop another buoy next to it. You know? Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
So it's not really about wave energy, but in your studies, did you ever encounter like the idea of a self-sustaining system that uses a small amount of power to generate a greater amount of power, and then powers itself and has usable excess energy?
Definitely. I mean, that's kind of what our system does now. Mm-hmm. I think a perfect example was that OTEC system I just showed you.
That's what.
They have a pump. They have an electric pump, and they generate the power. They use the surplus energy that they generate to run the system. So yeah, it takes a little bit of power to even run their system, and they generate that little bit of power as well as extra. So even like that nuclear power plant. I had an internship at that nuclear power plant, that's why I'm bringing it up. They do the same thing. That power plant itself needs a whole lot of power to run, but they just kind of bleed off a little bit of what they produce to drive the.
But even the OTEC system, it still requires an external source. You know what I mean? So have you ever?
It requires an external source for startup,
Mm-hmm.
but once the thing starts running, it can generate its own power to keep it going.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then also generate a lot more power to send back to the grid for people to use. Any other questions? Yeah.
So of course I want to go into like oceanography with like computer technology. How does one find a job for that? And they say like your professor told you to do that, but I guess like I don't want to just hopefully get part of someone's career and they go do research. But then for this, you also need funding. So how would y'all get paid for this as a job?
Well, so this is my job and my career right now, and it's interesting. That's like a whole other topic. That's like entrepreneurship, I guess. But there are lots of jobs out there. Generally, what was kind of cool about engineering is almost the entire, I would probably say 85% of my graduating class had a job lined up before they even graduated. I will say a lot of them, it wasn't the job that they wanted to keep, and they've done a lot of switching around. How you find the job that you want and that's right for you is a tricky one because it's not necessarily tricky to find the job you. It's not tricky to find the job you want. It's tricky to find out what job you want. You know, because I always thought I wanted to work for like NASA or something like a kid. That would be like really boring to me because I would just like sit in a cubicle and do calculations all day long. You know, so finding out what job you want and like internships are a great way to do that. I think. I'd say a huge thing is if there's something you have interest in, like go look for it.